everyone. We're going to read a fairy tale again, and this time it's one that people have probably heard of. This is Rapunzel Week. It's not like the Disney film. We'll read the real Grimm version of it, which is not the original, actually. I think this one, if I remember right from my fairy tale class, this is this is like I think the Brothers Grimm brought it over from Giambattista Basile, which is an Italian tradition, which it was also translated into French and then German, I think. Rapunzel has gone through a few iterations. We're going with a later one than the first, so not the very, very original, but I like to stick with the Grimm brothers, mostly because that's the book that I have. Hope you enjoy this rendition of Rapunzel, and maybe I'll go back and talk about kind of some of the differences between um, this one and the other ones if I remember any of the facts, because then we can learn from all of them. So here's the story of Rapunzel. Once upon a time there were a husband and wife who wanted a child for many years, but their wishes were all in vain. One day the woman became pregnant. Now, in the back of their house, that couple had a small window that looked over a fairy's garden, which was filled with all kinds of beautiful flowers and herbs, but nobody ever would enter the garden. However, one day, when the wife was standing at the window, she looked into the garden and she saw a beautiful bed of wonderful Rapunzel. She had a great craving to eat some of the lettuce, but she knew that she couldn't get any, so she began to waste away, and she just looked wretched. Eventually, her husband became horrified and asked what was wrong. Now, if I don't get any of that Rapunzel from the garden behind our house, I'll just die. Her husband loved her and thought, I'm going to get her some of that Rapunzel no matter what it takes. So, one evening, he climbed over the high wall into the garden. He grabbed a handful of the Rapunzel and he brought that lettuce to his wife. She immediately made a salad and ate it. But the Rapunzel tasted so good to her that she craved it even more the next day. Her husband knew that if she was ever going to be satisfied, he had to go back into the garden. So he went over the wall into the garden, but he was terrified when he stood face to face with the fairy, who angrily berated him for daring to come into the garden to steal her Rapunzel. He tried to make some good excuses by explaining that his wife was pregnant and that it was too dangerous to deny her the Rapunzel. All right, the fairy finally spoke. I'll let you take as much as you would like, but only if you give me the child that your wife is bearing. In his fear, the man agreed to all of it, and when his wife gave birth, the fairy appeared, named the baby girl Rapunzel, and took her away. Now Rapunzel grew to be the most beautiful child under the sun. When she turned 12 years old, the fairy locked her in a very high tower that had neither doors nor stairs, only a little window very high up. So when the fairy came to enter the tower, she would stand below and call out, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair. Rapunzel had beautiful hair that was as fine as spun gold. Every time she heard the fairy's voice, she unpinned her braids and wound them on a hook by the window. She let her hair drop 20 yards where the fairy would climb up on it. One day, a young prince went riding through the forest and came upon the tower. He looked and saw beautiful Rapunzel at the window. Then he heard her singing with her sweet voice, and he fell completely in love. However, there were no doors in the tower and no ladder to reach her window. Nevertheless, he went into the forest every day until one day he saw the fairy call out, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair. As a result, he now knew how to climb up into the tower. He took careful note of the words, and the next day at dusk he went to the tower and called out, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair. She let her hair drop, and when her braids were at the bottom of the tower, he tied them around him and she pulled him up. At first Rapunzel was extremely afraid, but soon the young prince pleased her so much that she agreed to see him every day and pull him up into the tower. So they had a very merry time and enjoyed each other's company. The fairy was not aware of this until one day Rapunzel was talking to her and said, "Tell me, Mother Gothel, why are my clothes becoming too tight? They don't fit me anywhere." "Oh, you child," the fairy replied, "what's this I hear?" She immediately realized that she was betrayed, and she was furious. She grabbed Rapunzel's beautiful hair, wrapped it around her left hand a few times, and took a pair of scissors with her right hand, and snip snap, the hair was off. Afterward, the fairy banished Rapunzel to a desolate land where she had to live in misery. In the course of that time, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. On the same day that the fairy banished Rapunzel, she fastened the braids that she cut off to the hook on the window, and that evening, when the prince called, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair," she let the braids down. When the prince climbed into the tower, he was astonished to find the fairy instead of Rapunzel. "You know what, you villain," the angry fairy said. "Rapunzel is lost to you forever." In his despair, the prince threw himself from the tower. He escaped with his life, but he lost both eyes. Sadly, he wandered around in the forest, eating nothing but grass and roots, and all he did was weep. Years later, he made his way to the same desolate land where Rapunzel was leading her wretched existence with their children. When he heard her voice, it was familiar, and then he recognized it. She recognized him too and embraced him. Two of her tears fell upon his eyes. Then his eyes became clear again, and he could see as usual. The end. All right. So, not the Disney version. It's a little more grim, right? That's kind of how it happens in these stories. So we'll just go through this and talk about some of the things that might be significant, relatable. Why do we even talk about this story? So we go from the beginning with this husband and wife. They want a kid, and once the wife becomes pregnant, she's like getting cravings. And that happens. Women get cravings when they're pregnant. I usually hear of cravings for like Wendy's Frosties or chicken nuggets or something. I don't think I know of any pregnant woman who's been like, "I want some lettuce." But that's okay. They didn't have Wendy's, so maybe that was the thing. Actually, here's what I learned in my class is that lettuce might have been used, I guess like this specific Rapunzel lettuce. I think that's, I think it might have been used for like cramps. I don't know if it was like a proven thing or if it was more just like a tale that people told that would help relieve cramps or the pains of being pregnant, but that might be part of this. In the original version, Basile's version, actually, I believe it was parsley. So maybe parsley does that, and then they just changed it to a Rapunzel lettuce. Um, yeah, kind of interesting. So pregnancy cravings are real, and like naturally, and maybe dutifully, it was her husband's job to help satisfy that craving and provide what the wife needs. I think that's fine, especially because they had wished so long for this pregnancy to occur. So like, of course he's gonna do what it takes to like take care of his wife, and well, it's too bad because then he lost sight of what was happening because he was in a circumstance when he faced the fairy. Like, first off, sounds like she's a dangerous fairy, right? Interesting that it's a fairy here. I think we're used to talking about her as a witch, or in the original story, I think it's an ogress. Like, I wouldn't want to live right by the ogress, but this very scary, powerful woman, anyway, and who has the capability to take your children away. I think it's important that we realize that the man made this decision. He agreed to this decision with the fairy, who didn't have his best interest in mind, who was probably a little selfish and greedy and definitely using the man and his wife for her own, whatever her own benefit was. It's not like she was singing to the hare and making herself young. That's a Disney creation, but perhaps she wanted a child, right? I don't know. But anyway, the man, the husband, father, made this decision out of fear to say, uh, I will take this lettuce in exchange for my child. Don't make decisions out of fear. I think that's an important lesson to learn. We can let fear inform us, but if it drives us in our decision making, that's an issue. Um, yeah, he feared both the fairy and maybe even his wife more than he loved this child, at least in that moment. Um, Again, I think our judgment is clouded by fear. So yeah, Rapunzel when she's 12 years old, which that's kind of a good age for women who have like started maturing, right? And I think that's a significant time that once she is becoming mature in her development as a she's just about to go into her teenage years, right? That's when the fairy decides, okay, I'm going to lock her in a tower, because um, that's when it becomes dangerous for a girl to be prancing around with all these boys. Now, I'm not saying I believe that it's dangerous for girls to turn 12 and that we should ever lock them up. I'm not saying that, but that might be the thinking behind like the timing um, of all of this, because it seems like the fairy didn't have her own children, and so maybe she was jealous of anyone else who could have one, and she was taking that away from them. And so not only did she take away the child from her neighbors, but it sounds like she's trying to take away. I mean, this is me reading into it, right? She might be trying to take away that opportunity from Rapunzel as well, saying, "Well, I didn't have children, and I'm just attributing really bad things to this fairy, right? But I didn't have children, then therefore, when your body starts to be even capable of having children, I'm not going to let you." Which sounds like a very bitter, vindictive way to approach life, especially when you're caring for somebody. Um, in this story, it doesn't even show like that the fairy loves Rapunzel, although she does later feel betrayed. So maybe there was this sense of um, wanting to be loved, but maybe not figuring out how to go about it the right way. Um, okay, then the prince comes onto the scene, right? He sees Rapunzel, he hears Rapunzel, and he falls for Rapunzel. Um, Young love, definitely. Like it's a young prince who's riding through the forest, um, and he's persistent. He falls pretty hard, pretty fast. I don't know what to take from that. Maybe that guys can be impulsive. They can really, when they see something good, they might say, "I'm going for it." Now, I don't think that that's something we can generalize to everybody, but we can be aware that there are people who, when they see something good, they won't stop until they can have it. And it seems like that's what the prince did. He kept going back every single day until he found out the magic words, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." So once he goes up, here's where the story gets even, I'm going to say dirty, because Rapunzel brings the prince up, and she's afraid because, well, this young man who is definitely interested in her, and maybe she doesn't know why, but she very soon finds out. The young prince pleased her so much, she clearly was pleased because she agreed to see him every day and kept pulling him into the tower. So it's not like she was like being taken advantage of by this young man. Um, without consent. But um, anyway, they had a merry time. They enjoyed each other's company. Clearly, they were having sex. And the fairy became aware of this when Rapunzel, who obviously didn't know what happened when people have sex, um, said, "My clothes are getting tight. They don't fit me anymore." Well, that's a pretty ignorant little girl, and it's sad that she wasn't taught those things, right? If she had been taught, if the prince had been a little bit more forthcoming in what could have been happening, um, I don't know. Seems like a sad thing to be ignorant of. So it's interesting that like I think this tower is supposed to like represent this place of isolation, virginity, purity, really. And then she becomes pregnant, starts to get bigger, because that's what happens when a woman gets pregnant. Her body changes, and even if she didn't know that that's what was going to happen, that's what happens when you do that. And immediately, so this fairy takes it very personally, and I think that's interesting that she feels betrayed by Rapunzel. Um, she takes it personally, and it just makes me step back and say, and I like to do this with all of the real villains in these stories, is like, how can I not be like them? So, do we ever take something that's like that really doesn't have to do with us? Do we take it personally? And do we respond with bitterness, with harsh uh, words or actions that don't help anybody? Because that's exactly what this fairy did. She cuts off Rapunzel's hair, which that's a consequence. So it's removing a form of her beauty. It took away her access to any visitors, specifically the young prince. So another form of isolation. Um, but then she's also banished to a totally desolate land, and that's interesting because um, I don't know if that's really much different from the existence that the girl was uh, experiencing in the tower, where she was alone in a tower, unless she was being visited by the prince or this fairy, who the fairy clearly didn't have her Rapunzel's best interest in mind. And so, um, kind of interesting what those consequences entail. Um, so she's in a desolate land, I guess a different desolate land, where the prince doesn't know where she is. And then the prince comes to face the fairy in the tower. He casts himself off, um, and it's sad because this fairy is very vengeful and bitter. She had already claimed Rapunzel as her own. She might have been jealous of those who could bear children, and now she's like, how could you ever do this to another person? I don't know if she was a man hater or what, but hopefully, I mean, I don't know what to really think about the fairy's interaction with the prince. She didn't kill him, but that's probably because he threw himself off the tower. And he, in this story, it glosses over it. He loses both eyes, so he's blinded, which I think it's probably nice that he's not made deaf, um, but he is blinded. One of the things that helped him fall in love with Rapunzel was his sight. Like, he found her very attractive. But then, thankfully, there were other senses. He found her beautiful singing voice, and that was important because that's how he found her in the end, right? And I think it's kind of cool at the very end when he does find Rapunzel, which it's miraculous. We don't know how he did, but he did. But that two of her tears fell upon his eyes, and his eyes become clear again, so he could see, like usual. And it's really cool that these tears that come from pain and love are what heal him and make it so that they can really be together again, because they did love each other. And it's it's an ending that's not totally conclusive. It doesn't say here they lived happily ever after. Actually, a fun way, it doesn't say this in here right now, but in some German ways, I think they say this phrase, um, where it's like, and if they haven't died yet, then they're still living. It's kind of like, well, their story went on. And I like that a lot, actually, because that's that's a way more accurate way of looking at it. But with this ending, we're somewhat satisfied, um, but we might feel like we're missing some retribution towards the fairy. And I think it's okay that we don't know what happens to the fairy. Like, evil, vindictive things like that will always be around. But what matters is that these two um, young ones who are in love can pick themselves up and move forward. And I think that's actually a beautiful thing. Um, it is a happy next step for him to be able to see. In a sense, both the prince and Rapunzel had their eyes opened in this story. One through her experiences becoming pregnant. Him, he literally like had his eyesight removed and then restored. Um, and I actually, when I read through this, I came to compare this in my mind to the Adam and Eve story in some ways, where people look at this and say there are these two people who are in this state of innocence and purity, where life is fine until and they partake of a fruit, right? And some people have interpreted that fruit to be like a sexual experience, um, and either way, so whether or not that's everyone's interpretation, like there is some similarities here where um, there's this kind of ignorant feeling in this Edenic place where things are provided for. There's not really much that you want or need, but there's like not a lot of learning going on. And then they're cast from the tower, both Rapunzel and Prince. They're Adam and Eve are both cast from the Garden of Eden. They fall literally from a tower. And Adam and Eve fell from this Garden of Eden, um, and had to provide in, they call it this desolate land, a place of misery. Adam and Eve had to provide in this harsh world for themselves. They had to toil for them and their children. And so I see these interesting similarities, and um, it's cool that like both Rapunzel and the prince, their journeys uniquely led them to being reunited. They had to face years of sadness, of difficulty, and toil before getting to be together and um, healing something. I think one more thing that we can learn there is that it is better when we are together with those that we love, and that's an important way to approach life. So, um, yeah, Rapunzel's an interesting story because there are some roots in, I would say, some of our biblical tradition, similar stories of falling and knowledge being earned, and being able to see new things that we can no longer see, and there being a force of evil that kind of creates that fall. And um, it's interesting to see these common themes and hopefully learn a little bit more together as we explore them. Um, so we get to take that story for what we want to. I don't know how much significance anyone else got from that. Those are just me babbling on about some of the things that I was thinking while I was learning. So I hope that you enjoy the Rapunzel story. I think it's an interesting one, whether it's Rapunzel or parsley or glowing hair that makes someone younger. It's a story that's lived on for a long time, so it's probably worth exploring.